If I'm being entirely honest, I find it incredibly difficult to criticize Persona 5. Not because it's a perfect piece of media, far from it in fact, but because it's a deeply personal experience to me. Persona 5 is one of those rare few things that really checks off all the boxes on the list of things that makes me personally happy while consuming media. To borrow from the Jungian-infused terminology of the game itself, Persona 5 fits nicely into my unique aesthetic. There are enough interesting things about this game that I could easily make 3 or 4 videos on different aspects of the experience, and maybe one day I'll get around to doing just that. But for now, I'm going to be sticking to the most obvious point of interest: the completely genre-subversive look and sound of Persona 5. Aside from being the most easily identifiable trait of Persona 5, the graphic and sound design is just jaw-droppingly fantastic, and I can think of no better example than, and if you played Persona 5, you can probably guess where this is going, the stunning all-out attacks. But they aren't the only places where the visual and auditory design get their chance to shine. Every little part of this game is absolutely filled to the brim with style and presence, from the post-battle celebrations to the text messages. And as far as the soundtrack is concerned, it's one of exactly 3 video game OSTs that I've gone out and bought so I can listen to it regularly, joining the likes of the Legend of Zelda series and Undertale in my music library. But before I get sidetracked gushing about my love for this game, let me put it in context for you. And this is going to be a long and confusing context section, so prepare yourself mentally for 40 years worth of Japanese role-playing games with obnoxiously long titles, questionable canonicity, and bizarre spin-off titles, many of which didn't get Western releases at all. And yes, this will be as convoluted as the history of Final Fantasy or Dragon Warrior. The only difference is that it's published by Atlus instead of Square Enix. That may seem odd considering Final Fantasy 15 and Persona 5 came out in the same year. Depending on how you count it, Persona 5 could be the 5th game in the series, or the 6th, or the 3rd, or the 11th, or the 16th, or you get it. It's complicated. Let's just get into it. Okay, so we're going to start with Persona 1 because that's the easiest place from which to start explaining this mess of a series timeline. The first Persona game's full title in the West is Revelations: Persona. You should notice that not only is that a weird name for the first game in the Persona series, and, not a sequel game in the Revelation series, but also I said that it's called Revelations Persona in the West, because its original title is Megami Ibunroku Persona. To confuse things even more, when it was ported to the PSP, the name was changed to Shin Megami Tensei Persona. So, the original Persona game is actually a spin-off of the Shin Megami Tensei series of video games, which is itself a sort of follow-up to the Megami Tensei series, all of which are classic JRPGs created by Atlus. By the time the original Persona game came around in 1996, Shin Megami Tensei was already an established series with a bunch of games in it, and Persona basically did all the same things any other Megami Tensei game would do. A couple years later, in 1999, Persona 2 Innocent Sin was released, followed a year later by the confusingly titled Persona 2 Eternal Punishment, which was a direct sequel to Persona 2 Innocent Sin. So now we've got 3 Persona games, 2 of which are named Persona 2, and all of which are closer to the other Shin Megami Tensei games than to Persona 5 in terms of look and feel. In 2006, the first modern Persona game, Persona 3, was released. This one shares much more in common with its sequels than its predecessors, and it started many of the trends that carried over into Personas 4 and 5. In 2008, Persona 4 came out and followed in Persona 3's footsteps, cementing the feel and style of the modern Persona games. Then, 2016 rolls around and Persona 5 comes out and turns every single knob up to 11, cranking up the intensity but otherwise sticking to a lot of the same ideas that Personas 3 and 4 pioneered. Oh, and because these games were made by a prolific Japanese game company, there are also a bunch of spin-off fighting, rhythm, and mobile games. And for the 5 of you who are upset I didn't mention the Devil Summoner games, I'm sorry, but I can't bring myself to talk about a sister series of a sub-series that shares a super series of the game I'm actually talking about. So the way I look at it, Persona 5 is the 3rd game in the Persona series, which consists of Persona 3, Persona 4, and Persona 5. And I'm just going to ignore the literal dozens of other games that are tangentially related because I don't care about them. Alright, that's done, let's move on. In Persona 5, you take on the role of Joker, a high school student who is wrongfully charged with assault as he awakens the power to call upon his persona, or other self, or magical representation of teenage rebellion, or JoJo stand. As he adjusts to his new life as a teenager on probation, Joker makes friends who have also awakened personas, and together they change the heart of evil adults who have lost their way. And that's the way they put it in the actual game, so don't get mad at me for sounding super corny there. They do this by magically jumping into literal mind palaces and fighting enemies called shadows by ripping off masks to reveal their personas. See, I wasn't kidding when I said Jungian terms are everywhere in these games. During these Shadow vs. Persona fights, if you put all of your opponents into a disadvantaged state, you can use an all-out attack like the one I showed you earlier to deal massive damage. The all-out attacks are fascinating to me, not because of how emblematic they are of the style of the game, but because they aren't unique in that respect, or even necessarily my favorite example of Persona 5 style popping out at the player. In any other game, the all-out attack would be the major selling point when it came to the style of the game, but in Persona 5 they barely register as one aspect of the bombastic visual design. This game forces you to acknowledge how different it is from the pack. In a world where most mainstream games use the same brown, gray, green color palette and understated orchestral score meant to be unobtrusive to the player, and most indie games focus on soft, warm color palettes with calming scores to gently prod the player along, Persona 5 uses bright, bold colors from every point on the wheel with pop art influenced visuals and a largely jazz-inspired soundtrack with actual vocals more often than not. If that were just throwing things at the wall and seeing what stuck, I might not be so excited to talk about it. But considering how well it all works and how cohesive and experienced Persona 5 is, clearly this was no accident, but rather the developers intentionally breaking from the tried and true. This kind of unexpected fusion of disparate ideas utilized in new ways is some of the most exciting stuff a creator can do for me. At worst, it makes the media stand out in a way that very little else can accomplish, but at best, it can become a game changer for the medium. I don't think Persona 5 will quite manage that, but I'll be very excited to see how it influences its genre and sequels at the very least. If every JRPG could take something from Persona 5, I'd want it to be a unique sense of style, so we could finally be free of the sea of generic games in the genre. And if there's one thing you really can't do, in regard to the Persona series as a whole, but particularly Persona 5, is call it generic. Particularly when comparing it to many of the other Megami Tensei games, which struggle to gain even a bit of popularity or influence among its peers. Persona 5 has some pretty severe issues that I think will keep it out of an unfortunate number of people's hands, but in my opinion, its strengths far exceed its drawbacks. It's experimental in so many ways, and it's one of the best examples of trying to push its incredibly old and stuck-in-the-past genre forward into the modern age. And while I've only talked about its unique sense of style in this video, that is not the only thing it has to offer. Persona 5 manages to nail about 80% of what it sets out to do, and considering how much of it is new ideas, or otherwise refined ideas that were previously tired beyond belief, I'd say that's a pretty fantastic outcome for producers and consumers both.
Can we